2008. Last time that a Democrat won the won the electoral college votes for North Carolina. The time before that was when we voted for a guy who just turned 100 the other day. So we haven't really done a lot of swinging. At the same time, we've been pretty purple for a long time. So I actually went back and found newspaper articles and accounts talking about us being a swing state, really every election except 1984. And by every election, I mean since the 1970s. So 1984, clearly there wasn't a lot of swinging to be done anywhere because, Reagan essentially ran the table on Mondale. But we've been there for a while. 2008, I think the world sort of took note of North Carolina because it did vote for Obama for president. But in some ways, I think the world took too much note because of every state that Obama won, his margin was the smallest in North Carolina of any of them. Cut forward to 2020, Georgia, quote, flips to the Democratic Party. North Carolina, quote, stays. But the reality is there were both the two states on each side of that razor's edge, right? North Carolina, the state that had the smallest Trump margin of any state that he won. Georgia, the smallest Biden margin of any state that he won. So I think we sort of overread sometimes the red blue. If there's anything that is purple, wouldn't it be the states that are kind of right in the middle?
And I think the other interesting point you brought up was 2008 and President Barack Obama winning the state, and in large part because we saw heavy Black turnout in the Charlotte area. And I think that transitions to a spotlight we're seeing in this election where there's been some concern of a lower Black turnout. I wanted to pull up something for folks. These are the latest numbers from the State Board of Elections, their absentee reports. They show that 19.65%, that's the Black population for voter registration statewide. And if you look at votes cast so far, it's 17.8%. So there's almost a 2 point gap there. For you, Chris, what are you seeing on the ground? And is it just I'm trying to read too early on takeaways and we're going to see a surge on election day and I'll be proven wrong? Or is this a legitimate sign that the Harris campaign should be concerned about?
I guess like the meme says, why not both, right? Like I think it is very possible that we see these patterns change on election day. I think I'd also point folks to the large number of unknowns there. That is so Michael Bitzer, who I see on this call here, I see a smiling face. He and I have written a little bit about this, the large number of the increasing number of folks who don't check any race at all, any gender at all, any of these optional categories. So there's a lot more noise in the data than there were just a few years ago. So it is possible, we don't know, but it's possible that some of those unknown folks are actually people of color, and maybe those numbers actually look a little bit better in reality. We don't know. In terms of election day, obviously, we're just going to have to see what happens. You're exactly right. The African American vote has been certainly a sore spot and a problem for the Democratic Party recently. You mentioned '08 as being a positive. I'll sort of point out 2022 as being a real negative, and one of the, probably many reasons that the Democrats lost the U.S. Senate election in 2022. So that is definitely one of the storylines I'll be watching is what does the racial makeup of the electorate finally look like?
I appreciate you entertaining me. Brian Reporter grasping at tea leaves here, trying we just wait 12 more hours is probably the correct answer. 10 or 12 more hours, just wait,
Or
get some
15 or 16, we'll
take a
see.
nap, and then come back for when it actually matters. When we see the polls close, 7:30. If you're in line by 7:30, stay in line. 7:30 polls close for folks, and then when should people expect results tonight in North Carolina? When are we going to even have a winner in North Carolina tonight?
I think we'll probably have a winner for Commissioner of Agriculture. I think we'll likely have a winner. That's what you're talking about, right, Brian?
Yeah,
Uh,
everyone's here because they care about the Ag Commission race, I'm sure.
That's exactly right. We've got, perhaps insurance. So we have somebody on this call who's running in a primary for insurance commissioner. So maybe that's the one we're watching. But no, in all seriousness, I don't know. One thing I'd point folks to is that the General Assembly changed the rules on counting and pre-processing ballots. So it used to be that at 2 o'clock on election day they could start processing some of these early votes, and they're now having to wait until 7:30 until polls close to do that. The same thing was true in the primary, and the sky didn't fall, right? It wasn't horrible. There wasn't massive delays. We did have to wait longer. And given the volume that we're going to see today and that we saw in early voting in the general election, we're going to have to wait even longer. So I guess most important thing from my perspective is that if there is a delay, that doesn't mean something's wrong. That means that county election officials are following the law that was put forth by the General Assembly. So, yeah, please.
No, good. I was just going to say, I think one thing that I've heard from both sides has been don't expect a final result at the presidential level tonight. Just to reiterate that for folks, especially in PA, that's the one state I've heard maybe Thursday. So just to emphasize for folks, even if North Carolina is called, that might be a good indicator of where things go. Especially if Harris wins, we could see something closer. But if Trump wins, it looks increasingly like it might come down to PA, for sure. And the other one I wanted to pull up was just, we talked about black turnout and that being a concern for Harris. Well, one thing that could be a concern for Trump in your part of the state, Chris, Western North Carolina, we see these Hurricane Helene counties, and I had pulled this data over the weekend. So it's possible we saw some slight changes based on just the state getting more ballots the last couple of days. But as of a few days ago, what I had seen was really an underperformance. The headline was North Carolina Republicans see turnout lagging in Helene counties. And we have seen, a big concern was, will people show up in these Hurricane Helene counties? And we have seen turnout doing pretty well in most of these places. But if you look at the John Locke Foundation vote tracker, I had sort of broken it down by registered Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated voters. Again, there could be crossover voters. We might not know how unaffiliated voters are skewing, so it's not as simple as it can be portrayed. But generally speaking, you look at Democrats, they're overperforming their statewide turnout in these Helene counties. Republicans are underperforming their statewide turnout in these Helene counties. So I guess the interesting thing too is that you have a really close race here for Lindsey Prather. That is something that could make or break the legislative supermajority. So from the presidential level, from the local level, what are you seeing in Western North Carolina, Chris, and how can it impact things?
Yeah, I mean, it can impact things. I'll sort of take that part first and then go back to the others. It can impact things because, we had a Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court race a few years ago decided by 401 votes. So from that perspective, almost anything can matter, right? We have over 500,000 registered voters in these counties, in the Helene counties. And, there's a few different ways to look at these data, and I think you've done a good job breaking it down. One thing I would point out to folks is I think that the 13 counties is the way to look at the Helene effects. I've seen some things that talk about the 25 counties that are the ones affected by FEMA order. I think the just living in Western North Carolina, the conditions are very different in those 13 than they are in the remainder of those counties. So first of all, I think that's the right way to look at it. We are seeing turnout be about on par, but that's a little misleading. And the reason it's misleading is what you just pointed out. We're seeing overperformance of Democrats and underperformance of Republicans. Now, in a normal year, I'd say big deal, right? This is early voting always does better for the Democratic Party. But this year, when statewide, the Republicans are outperforming the Democrats, to see that deviation from that pattern, to me, that says there's something important going on there, right? Somehow either the message to Republicans to vote early didn't get there, or the Democrats are just doing a great job turning out. And I think you calculated this the right way, thinking about total votes. And of course, Buncombe County is where those votes are. So if you look at all 100 counties, the vast majority, I think it's like 3/4, the Republicans are outperforming the Democrats. There's a small number where the Democrats are outperforming the Republicans, and the biggest gap in the entire state through early voting was Buncombe County, right?
Which includes the city of Asheville for folks who aren't steeped in North Carolina politics. It's a big urban hub.
That's exactly right. Big urban hub and big, certainly leans left Buncombe County in general since 2004 has gone for the Democratic candidate for president every time. So this really is a story of Buncombe County. I'm also glad you pointed out 115, the Lindsey Prather Ruth Smith district. This is one of the key races to watch in the whole state. I know you and I have talked about it a good bit. We have a Democratic incumbent named Lindsey Prather. She really had kind of an easy path to victory, as did all Democrats in Buncombe County until the redraw. And so when we redrew those districts, we created two safe Democratic seats. So that's Eric Ager and then Brian Turner, who doesn't even have opposition because the person who was in that district, Caleb Rudow, is running for Congress. Brian Turner, who was out, is now going to be back in again. But then,
Simple.
yeah, very simple. Like you don't need to worship into this at all. Easy to explain, right? And then the one competitive district out of the three is Lindsey Prather's district. It leaned slightly towards the Republican Party in the 2020 election. And so the question going in was, is this going to be one where the Republicans can pick off a Democrat? Clearly they tried. They've been financing Ruth Smith very, very well. Prather's also getting financed very well on the Democratic side. So this is a true battleground district that could decide whether the Republicans have the supermajority or not. And these early data look pretty good for Lindsey Prather.
And again, for folks, this is Western Carolina University political scientist Chris Cooper. This isn't some national pundit talking about Buncombe County. This is someone who really lives and breathes and knows the area there. I wanted to open it up for questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to go into the chat, raise your hand, and I can unmute you, or just put it in the chat if you wanted to make a comment. I have a couple more questions for Chris as people are thinking if they have any questions. One thing that is very interesting in this race for president is we have seen Trump with some messaging on early voting. He has said he would want one-day voting if it were up to him. He has also kind of said, in these Helene counties, I had said if it was 25 to 50%, that would be great turnout. And I'm just curious if either of those, that messaging on Helene or his calls for one-day voting, is that just noise that no one will care about, or could that have a practical effect?
I think the calls for one-day voting aren't going to have any effect. I mean, you've got to be awful tuned in to be able to get that message, right? And to have that message somehow affect your decision to vote. I think the Republican Party writ large has done a very good job getting voters to come out and vote early, to bank your vote, right, in their terms. That has been, I think, a successful strategy. We see that in the early voting numbers. Whether they have cannibalized their vote or not, we can sort of leave that maybe, well, I would say for another day, for tomorrow, when we'll actually know the other side of that equation, know if that's true or not. But I think that's been successful. The Helene thing, it's been good. It's been positive, obviously, that we're seeing voter turnout looks so high, looks so good. I would caution folks a little bit because what we see when we look at Katrina, what we see when we look at Hurricane Michael, some of these other storms is, yes, they do tend to depress turnout, but it tends to be on election day. Right. And this makes sense because you've got flexibility for mail-in voting. You've got flexibility for early voting. So if we see this negative effect, it may actually come today. So I think when I say to wait, I'm not just being pedantic here. I think it really could be the difference maker, not because we just need to wait and be patient, but because election day voting is fundamentally different than early voting.
I remember talking and folks were, I was saying, could these Helene counties have an opposite effect as intended? And could we see mobilized support? And the consensus I got from every single person I talked to was, Brian, no. I mean, that's not going to happen. And so far, it seems like we have seen a mobilizing effect on the Democratic side, maybe not so much on the Republican side, but this is the day where we will truly know. We have a question from that former insurance commissioner candidate you had mentioned, David Wheeler. He asks, Professor Chris, Professor Chris, do you have any inkling of a surprise tonight? Is there one thing that's weird that you think may surprise everyone tonight?
That's a great
And
question.
David saying Mr. 22% because that was his share of the vote for the insurance commissioner primary there.
That's right. And I believe David also has a picture of, is that George Clooney that David is going as today? So I appreciate that as well. So yeah, I mean, the nature of a surprise is we don't see it coming, right? But I mean, I think the Democrats right now the Democrats have four folks on the Council of State. And I think it is possible that they could actually increase that number over the course of the day, obviously. I think it's possible they could end up with five. I think that is potentially something that could be surprising. Trying to think what else would be a big surprise that we might see. I don't think we're going to see Mark Robinson surprise. I think the question is how much of the is the down ballot effect going to happen there. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure what exactly the nature of a surprise is. I don't know that I see it coming, but I really do believe sincerely that anything's possible at the presidential level. I think anything's possible at the congressional district one level, the one competitive race in the state. I think we've got some really competitive council of state races, some of which have had almost no polling. So I think we're all just sort of shooting blind. Like I see a lot of Dave Bullock signs with the cool glasses for auditor. Does that translate to votes? I haven't really seen any polling or indication about what's going to happen there. So I guess any of that could be a little bit of a surprise.
For my end, the surprises I've spoken to with people are first congressional district, as you mentioned. That's the only toss-up congressional seat in the entire Southeast region. So we got several states, and there's only one seat that even matters. Lori Buckhout, from people I've spoken to, uh, they see her as a quality candidate. They see Don Davis as a quality candidate, and with black voter turnout lagging statewide, if that happens there, this is a seat that no Republican has won since 1883. I'm aware party ideology has changed over the course of that time, but all that to still say this has been a Democratic stronghold, but one that Republicans could win. That I don't think a lot of people have accepted that. Uh, there's certainly a feeling that Davis is a favorite, but maybe how much of a favorite, I'm not sure. And the other surprise that I have heard is the governor's margin. People have seen double digits in polling. Cooper won by 4.5 points, and this could be something decided by single digits, 6 points. I think people might be surprised by the margin. So those are just a couple surprises I think I might have. Ryan asked, are there any suburban races you'll be following, Chris?
Sure. Yeah, there are, and I'll just sort of hop in real quick too on NC1, just because I think it's such a fascinating race. We got maybe 25 toss-up races across the entire country, right? So fewer than one per state. One of them's in North Carolina. The only one in the Southeast, as Brian talked about. But I would just say sort of voting patterns are fascinating on that race because you've got a slight, like 1 point Biden advantage in 2020, but then you had a larger Ted Budd advantage in 2022. So is this a district that is moving towards the Republican Party? Was that a unique election? Like we don't really know what the answer is in that district. So that is just a fascinating one to watch because there's so little we know. Um, on the suburban races you're following, yeah, I mean, certainly the one everybody's following nationally, the Nicole Sidman versus Tricia Cotham race, right? She, of course, of the big party switch. If you're on this call, I assume you're nerd enough. I don't need to play that one out too much. um, depending on how you define suburban, the Aaron Paré district in Wake County, I think is fascinating for a number of reasons. Obviously, she's a rising star in the Republican Party, but she's got a tough race on her hands. I also think if she does lose that race, if the Democratic challenger is able to win, I sort of ask myself, when might the Republican Party get another toehold in Wake County? Like, how much longer is it going to be before we see another Republican in Wake County? So that one is critical, I think, because of the very specifics of the race, but also for what it might mean for the future. Same thing with Prather's district, which I would not call a suburban. It's sort of actually a little more rural, really. But I would call that district one that how else could the Republicans get a toehold in Buncombe County if they don't get that one? So sort of three across the state. I guess if you want to define the Wilmington district, state Senate district as suburban, that might be another one to throw in there as well.
From people who are tuning in, who are going to see election night results and wonder which counties do I look at? Where are the bellwethers when the results come in? Which places should they be looking to see a read on the night and how it's going?
Yeah, great point, Brian. So New Hanover County is the one that if you gave me one county to watch, and obviously you and I have talked about this some in the past, it's a fascinating place. It's swung back and forth for the presidential election. For Council of State, it got 9 out of 10 races correct. In other words, they picked the winner for 9 out of these 10 races. Voted for Sherry Beasley in 2022, the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate, but also the Republican incumbent for Congress. The county commission's gone back and forth. Like this place is almost schizophrenic and how much it jumps around between the two parties. So New Hanover would be kind of the one to watch for me. I also think it's fascinating because you've got this really interesting state Senate race. You've got a lot of in-migration, but it's not bluing the place quite as fast as you might think. So that is, if you want to nerd out on one county, I'd head to the coast. Luckily, it's good food out there. Nash County is another one I would watch. So Nash is this sort of rare exception to the rule. It's a rural county that has tended to do better, slightly better for the Democratic Party, but it's swung back and forth. And the real question I have there is that Roy Cooper is from Nash County. And so this will be the first statewide election since like, I think it's 2000.
80s. Yeah, he was like a candidate in the 80s, and I think it's the first presidential election cycle. He was in on the ballot in 1988, so you'd have to go back to like 1984 where he wasn't on a presidential election cycle ballot in Nash County.
So it's fascinating, right? So what does that look like? How much of what we've seen in Nash County is a Roy Cooper effect versus how much we've seen in Nash County is really a county that sort of bucks these bigger trends? So those would be two I'd watch. A couple more I might watch for margins. Cabarrus County, kind of close to Charlotte area, has been a little bit of a kind of shoulder district. It's obviously been better for the Republican Party. If you just look at red, blue, you're going to see red, 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 red. But the margins are getting smaller every cycle in Cabarrus County. They got a lot of in-migration there, things we're not really picking up in our data. And one to watch that I think is not on people's radar would be Henderson County. Now, look, it's going to vote for Donald Trump. I know that, you know that, everybody knows that. But the margins are getting smaller there. And so as we think about Western North Carolina, as we think about small statewide margins, does it become a little bit more pink again this cycle? That could be a difference maker in a tight race.
And I'll pull this up for folks. Just for the record, I did get some insight from Chris Cooper beforehand, and Henderson County is one of my 8 counties to watch for. Folks can go to Anderson Alerts and see the 8 counties. I had Meck, Buncombe, New Hanover, Wake, Henderson, Cumberland, Nash, and Wilson as 8 to watch. The one that I don't think is getting that much attention is Cumberland, and for Black turnout. That's going to be a pivotal one. That's obviously the Fayetteville area. Finally, just Chris, looking at the absentee voting numbers here for folks, we've seen almost 4.5 million people cast a ballot thus far. What should people take away from all the early voting data? And most importantly, what shouldn't people take away from it?
Yeah, I think what they should not take away is that they know the winner. So I've even seen some people try to predict the outcome. Say, hey, I'm going to look at, which party turned out better in early voting, and that's how I'm going to predict what happens in a state. Like that, if you were to use that strategy in Las Vegas, it'd be a great way to lose a lot of money real fast, right? These data are really interesting. They're really important. They tell us things about mobilization. They tell us things about how people are casting their vote. They don't do a great job predicting the future. And the reason, of course, is you have this huge part of the equation we don't know, the election day vote. The thing that I'm taking away is not going to make anybody feel better, regardless of your partisanship, and it is just more uncertainty, right? So we've had unaffiliated voters be the largest group of registered voters in the state for some time now. Crossed Democrat in 2017, crossed Republican a couple of years ago. But this is the first time where we've seen, at least thus far, they're the largest group of voters. More unaffiliated people have cast a vote than Democrats or Republicans. So it is not just weaseling out of the question to say that how those unaffiliated folks go will ultimately likely determine the outcome of the election in North Carolina.
And we have time for one more question. Then I'll let Chris go to his fun, active day of tracking North Carolina politics. David asks, if I can get a second bit at the apple, are you seeing anything that points to Dems and Meck getting their act together? I think we know which party David's from and turning out the base.
Yeah. David, you're not going to like this answer. Well, in any way, I don't see anything saying that they are, but I don't see anything really saying they're not. I mean, they're just kind of following statewide patterns for the most part. I mean, that I was trying to figure out which state legislative districts are bucking the trend, thinking in my mind that maybe we would see the Cotham race buck trends. By buck trends, I mean Democrats outperforming Republicans in terms of vote share. We're not really seeing that. So it looks like right now Meck is just kind of holding with the state as a whole. So I don't know. Nothing that suggests that they are. Nothing that suggests they're really not. It just kind of looks like a ho-hum story thus far, which I think from your perspective would probably be bad news.
Chris, the book for folks is Anatomy of a Purple State. Chris Cooper, Western Carolina University. Thanks for coming on. We appreciated having you. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. We do have some data on the propensity of voters by party. I'll pull that up here one more time. Again, we see turnout among Republicans is 63.6, turnout among registered Democrats 59.2, turnout among unaffiliated voters 51, to answer that question quick. So, Chris, thank you so much for tuning in and coming on. It was great having you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I appreciate it. Good to see everybody. Good to see some friendly faces.
And thank you all for joining. If you liked it, we'll do it again. But have a fun election night. 7:30 polls close, and follow Anderson Alerts. We'll have lots of coverage. Thank you all and take care.